The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening is one of the best-selling Zelda games of all time if you combine its multiple versions. Its unique setting of Kahulan Island and the general thematic progression of the game, which I won't spoil by the way, give it a strong identity and charm to differentiate itself from the others. But what about my favorite part of Zelda games? Are the dungeons any good? The short answer is yes, definitely. One dungeon in particular might be a contender for my favorite 2D Zelda dungeon of all time, but you know how it goes. With any good thing, we have to rank them. Worst to best. So, what exactly counts as a dungeon? Well, that's obvious. Mostly. All of the numbered dungeons are included along with the secret color dungeon. Only exception here is the Windfish Egg. I know the wiki counts this as a dungeon, but if you've played the game, I'm sure you'll understand why I'm not ranking it. It's a glorified padlock blocking entry to the final boss. Speaking of, bosses are not being taken into consideration here. This is just about the dungeons themselves. Mini bosses are fair game though, but with all that yapping out of the way, it's time to rank. Number 9. Bottle Grotto. For the second dungeon of the game, this really feels like it could pass as the first. And right there, we have my main issue here summed up. This game has great dungeons as I said earlier, but the first few just being basic caves makes it a little tricky to tell them apart sometimes. Tail Cave is the first, so that one gets a pass, but Bottle Grotto manages to blend in without bringing that much to the table. This is the dungeon where you unlock the power bracelet. As a result, most of the progression relies on blocking off areas with bottles that you can't lift. There isn't anything wrong with that on paper. I mean, the Face Shrine does a similar thing later on, but that can't be the only thing you have. This is a by-the-numbers dungeon if I've ever seen one. On a more positive note, there are still things I like here. The Shy Guy enemies that require a spin attack to kill are some of my favorite enemies in the game, even though that might just be because I like Shy Guys. And switches are always fun to play around, even if their implementation isn't the most revolutionary thing in the world. There's nothing really wrong here, even if the dungeon itself is a bit of a snooze fest. Wait. There is actually something I didn't like here. You see, near the end of the dungeon, you come across this room with 3 enemies in it. You normally wouldn't think much of it, but the compass tells you that there's a key in here which you need to progress. Only thing is, the puzzle is kinda stupid. Basically, all you need to do is kill the enemies in a specific order to spawn the chest. The problem with that though is there's no hint as to what order, so it just boils down to trial and error. I might have missed something, and if so, that's my bad. But as is, this puzzle isn't fun or intuitive in the slightest. I only even knew that it had to do with the enemies at all because they play a buzzer sound after killing all of them. From that I guess it had something to do with the order. But I could imagine someone taking way longer on this. Again, I might be missing something, but there should have been some sort of hint here. At the very least one that was easy to find considering this is required to beat the dungeon. Overall, Bottle Grotto isn't terrible or anything like that, but it suffers from being forgettable and having some questionable design. So for that, it's my least favorite from the game. Number 8. Tail Cave. When it comes to starter dungeons, this one is fairly run-of-the-mill. The enemies are basic and navigation doesn't take too much effort. It's unlikely you'll get lost or stuck here as everything is mostly straightforward. This is where you obtain Rock's Feather, one of the best Zelda items maybe of all time. All it does is allow you to jump, but with that simple of an upgrade, everything becomes so much more interesting. New ways to traverse the world are opened up to you, and combat encounters become more complex as well. Not to mention that it makes side-scroller sections a lot better than they'd be otherwise. A dungeon item being good isn't going to affect the ranking that much, but this one is too standout to ignore. That aside, what we have here isn't too different from what we saw in Bottle Grotto. As I said, it's a basic dungeon with basic theming and basic puzzles, but unlike Bottle Grotto, this is the first one, so it can get away with that a lot more. There's an excuse here for being mundane. You want to ease players in, and because this game doesn't have a Hyrule Castle or anything like that, I understand why it's like this. And besides, Tail Cave isn't even that bland. There's some enemies you have to be creative to kill, by either luring them into a pit like what I thought you had to do at first, or the easier and far more effective way of putting up your shield to tip them over. And the mini-boss makes good use of the Rock's Feather, requiring you to jump over the steel girder and hit him while he moves to the other side. This dungeon introduces everything in a digestible way for newcomers, and is still decently fun to explore for people who already know what they're doing. I won't pretend this is the greatest dungeon of all time. I mean, it's only number 8 on the list, but there's nothing here that I actively dislike, and that's how you know you have a good dungeon lineup. Number 7. Color Dungeon. As a secret dungeon that requires you to remember a code from the library to access, I expected a little more. This dungeon has a lot of cool concepts and mechanics, but I just wish that it went further with them. I'm getting ahead of myself though. What's so unique about this dungeon? Well, it was originally added as a bonus to the game when Link's Awakening was ported to the Game Boy Color, which I mean, what gave it away. As a result, everything from puzzles to traversal to the enemies you face has something to do with color. There's these switches that change their color and that of the switches around it when hit, the goal being to make all of them the same color. This is a super fun mechanic that leads to some good puzzles, but notice I said some. While the switches themselves are amazing, none of the puzzles go far enough with the idea. Give me some more complex layouts, or rooms where you need to approach it from multiple sides to hit different switches, or even just something a bit more challenging. Most of the times you see these, the puzzle is over before you even had a chance to think about what you were doing, and that's a shame because of the huge potential that these things have. I still love the mechanic, but in a world where this is a late game dungeon instead of an early to mid game one, I can see it being utilized in much more thought-provoking ways. Enough about that though. The platforms that bounce you up and crumble more and more over time might not be too dangerous, but they're enjoyable to interact with, and that's a plus in my book. Even the enemies are some of the best because you have to take positioning into account if you want to defeat them. Above all else, this dungeon does its theme incredibly well, and the mini-boss where you need to jump over his slams or else you get stunned is one of my favorites in the game. To be honest, I like this guy more than many of the actual bosses. It's clear the amount of potential this dungeon had, and its foundation is strong, but I don't feel it fully lives up to what it could have been. You might have noticed, but I haven't really mentioned anything outside of the gimmicks, and that's because this dungeon is its gimmicks. If you take those away, the navigation here is as simple as Tail Cave, the first dungeon of the game. That's not to say that this dungeon doesn't have any merit to it. The glimpses of greatness were enough for me to put it at number 7 after all, and I'm sorry if this section felt overly negative, but I just wish this dungeon had realized its full potential. As it stands though, I still enjoyed it for what it was. Number 6. Key Cavern. You wouldn't think that your dungeon gimmick being keys would be interesting, but surprisingly, it is. The whole dungeon is structured around having an insanely high number of locks, and an equally ridiculous number of keys. But that through line makes it fun to go through, because you never know what will be behind the next door you unlock, and you never know when you'll get another key. It gives this dungeon a good sense of flow because you constantly feel like you're making progress. The loop at the end where you need 4 whole keys is super satisfying to get through, not only because you can unlock them all at once, but because when you see the locks there, it changes your objective to be something more like searching for terminals in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. You need to scavenge for the keys to progress, so once you find all of them, it's very rewarding. You can probably tell, but this is where the dungeons start to get really good. The Pegasus Dash is obtained here, and you get it fairly late into the dungeon. That complements the theming well though, because now you need to go back to areas you've already been through, but with the Pegasus Dash. This allows you to get more keys that you need to beat the dungeon. Everything here is connected, and the backtracking doesn't feel like a chore because you just got a new way to run through areas faster. If there's one thing I'm not the biggest fan of, it's that some enemies here are a little annoying. The birds that teleport away from you in particular can be a pain to fight. Not so bad if you manage to collect enough money for the bow by now, but I didn't. And to be honest, the snake muncher guys are a little frustrating because it seems like there's a cooldown between when you can bomb them. Not necessarily a bad thing, but I found that it made them more troublesome to fight than they needed to be. This isn't a big deal or anything, but I still felt like I should give it a mention. Key Cavern is an excellent example of how you can make an early game dungeon engaging, and it's one of my favorites for it. Number 5. Angler's Tunnel. This has to be the prettiest dungeon in the game. The water combined with the greenery makes it look so beautiful. Another superficial thing I'd like to point out here is the music. It's one of my favorite songs in the game, and it's just an all-around fantastic ambient track. That aside, this is a water dungeon of sorts, so it should be no surprise that you get the flippers here. The way they transform all the negative space into traversable water really opens up the dungeon once you get them. No longer are you avoiding water or else you drown. There's even these panels that need to be stepped on in a certain order to proceed, but in one case you have to get to one that's only accessible through water or another panel. The thing is that the one further out needs to be pressed first. A simple but creative use for flippers that's satisfying to complete, because as soon as you see this room you just immediately know that flippers are going to be the dungeon item. Stuff like dropping a key through a hole instead of onto the ground gives this dungeon a bit of personality, because it drops down into water so you can't reach it until you get the flippers. Stuff like this is both memorable and charming. I mean, they could have realistically just put a pool of water in the first room that the key drops down into, but they went the extra mile and it pays off by making the dungeon feel more unique. The enemies also fit so extremely well here. The Water Strider guys single-handedly make this place better because the way they move, the way they look, everything about them is perfect as an enemy for this area. Even the mini-boss is really good. Sure, he's simple, especially if you know what you're doing, but his simplicity makes him enjoyable to fight, and trying to kill him as fast as possible is super fun to do. I think design-wise, you could easily make a case for Key Cavern being better, but the aesthetic and vibes of this dungeon are unmatched, and that combined with still great design makes me like it more. Number 4. Catfish's Maw. I know I praised the last dungeon for its aesthetic, but this is also a dungeon with a good atmosphere. On the surface level, it may seem like yet another cave, but with all the dripping water and sand, it really feels like you're in a secluded waterlogged cavern. The atmosphere isn't even the best part though. That would have to be the dungeon layout. With all the different ways to go, it can get confusing, but in a fun way. The way where you're always wondering what will be around the next corner or how to get to certain places. The Stolfos only being able to be fought in a specific order adds to this because I found the fourth one first, for instance, and I was left wondering what it even meant. I love this type of design because it keeps you engaged in what's happening and always asking questions. While there aren't any individual rooms that have too tricky of puzzles or standout set pieces, the whole of this dungeon works together to create what feels like a naturally occurring maze. Each corridor you walk down fills you with more and more questions of how big is this place? Because this is easily the biggest dungeon you've been to by this point in the game after all, and the abundance of stairs that lead you to opposite parts of the cave adds to this feeling. More than any other dungeon, they actually feel like tunnels that connect parts of the map instead of arbitrary teleportation points. This is also where you get the hookshot, which needs no introduction. It's one of the series' most common recurring items for a reason. It's simply fun to use, and this iteration is no different. If there was one thing I'd have to criticize about this dungeon, it's the Stolfos mini-boss. Don't get me wrong, he's fun to fight, but too much of a good thing makes it begin to lose its luster. You have to fight him 4 whole times, and I like that from a dungeon perspective for the reason I mentioned earlier, but actually having to refight him that many times starts to get old by the end. Not a big problem, especially because he's relatively effortless to kill, but it's still something I thought was worth bringing up. The fact that this dungeon isn't higher is almost criminal, but I think it's more of a testament to this game's dungeon quality than anything else. Number 3, Turtle Rock. Alright, the verdict is in. I think I do like this Turtle Rock more than the one in Link to the Past. It's stiff competition, but this Turtle Rock has plenty to call its own. The main gimmick here is the cursor platforms. You control where they go and use them to reach new areas. You even get something if you fill the whole gap in a room. These are a neat addition. They add some more interactivity to the dungeon, and even though you don't get as much freedom as with the moving platforms in Turtle Rock, you still get to decide where you want to go. And that's a huge part of why this dungeon is so tricky to navigate. Oh yeah, this might be the most confusing dungeon in the game. I know a lot of people would point towards the dungeon you do just prior to this as more confusing, but I think this one takes the cake in terms of simply not knowing where to go. In fact, there's even multiple locked doors here that aren't required to progress, because if you know how to make your way around the dungeon, you can get to both sides of them yourself. Now, whether that's exactly good design or not is up to you, but personally I think it's a neat reward for being able to find your way effectively. I still took the time to unlock them though, because I like to 100% complete dungeons if I can. The burn rod is obtained here, and it's kind of busted. Unlike basically every other Zelda game, there's no mana here, so that means you can spam it to your heart's content. Again, not sure if that's a good or bad thing, but it's undeniably fun to mess around with. The ice block puzzles specifically designed around it are some of my favorites in the game. You have to figure out the exact places to use your rod since it will burn through everything in a straight line. It's one of those puzzles where you just stare at it for a while until the solution clicks, and as it goes, I like those kinds of puzzles a lot. Another big standout puzzle is this one with the snake muncher guys. You see, once you defeat them, a chest will spawn above you. The catch is that you can't reach the upper area without finding an exit out of the dungeon which brings you there. Side note, I love it when dungeons take you outside of them, so that's extra points for me. When you get back inside, however, you'll notice that the chest is despawned. After a bit of thinking, you realize it's because you left the dungeon. Even if you go back down to kill them again, the chest will still be despawned when you come back up. A bit of a conundrum, isn't it? Well, the reason I like this puzzle so much is it's one of those ones where the solution feels so obvious once you figure it out. You need to, instead of fighting the enemies at the bottom level, throw bombs from the top. What a genius use of the bombs. I'm sure for some people this wasn't hard to solve, but for me it took a while before it clicked. When it did though, everything made way more sense. Creative puzzles with out-of-the-box solutions are the best ones, and this is exactly that. One annoying thing is that the eye statues were weirdly hard to hit with the bow. I don't know if it was just me, but it seems a little bit too precise. Honestly, I thought I couldn't even hit it with the bow because of how many shots just did absolutely nothing. This might be a remake exclusive problem, but it's still something that has no real reason to be like that. Doesn't come close to ruining the dungeon though. And one last thing I'd like to mention, the dungeon is actually shaped like a turtle, so I guess that's why it's better than the Link to the Past version. Number 2. Face Shrine. The glorious return of switches is here. I do enough switch glazing as is, and this won't be the last time for this video, but their utilization here is way better than in Bottle Grotto, for example. You get to do interesting stuff like throwing bombs right out of screen transition and platforming on them with the Rock's Feather. The Powerful Bracelet is just an upgrade to the Power Bracelet, and as a result is basically a glorified Master Key, but for that purpose it serves it well. And unlike Bottle Grotto, this dungeon has a whole lot going for it outside of the dungeon item. I know I mentioned the music for Angler's tunnel, but the song here is genuinely amazing. Not in the chill vibe way, but more in the grand masterpiece way. I said I wasn't going to give story spoilers, so I'll refrain from doing so here, but all I'll say is that this dungeon is where a pretty big revelation takes place, so the music being what it is matches perfectly with what this dungeon represents. And I mean, hey, you can see it too. This place is also super good looking as well. We get introduced to these chess pieces here, and they bounce diagonally from where they land, just like a knight in chess. At first I thought their bouncing was random, but once I noticed that the floor was checkered, I instantly understood how awesome of an idea this was. Again, I'm not trying to spoil anything, but it's hard when it comes to this dungeon in particular, because its theming is so important to why it's good. Basically, everything here is related to faces. The name of the dungeon should have given that away. There's a lot of face statues scattered around. One of the main enemies is shy guys who hide their face. The dungeon is shaped like a face. You even had to defeat a boss by attacking his face to gain entry. Hell, the boss of this dungeon is literally just a face. All of this paints a clear picture that this dungeon is about facing the truth, confronting the reality of the situation at hand. It's weirdly dramatic for a game that puts on this cutesy facade. What is a facade but hiding one's true face anyway? I know this might seem like I'm reading too far into it, and maybe I am, but I felt it was important to talk about because all of that is a big reason why this dungeon is so high. Without it, it's not as impressive as something like Turtle Rock or Catfish's Maw. It would still be good, but not to the extent that it is with those factors taken into consideration. However, gameplay reigns supreme when it comes to dungeons, so while I do love everything the Face Shrine sets out to do, I think there's one more that's so good I couldn't possibly put it any lower than first. Number 1. Eagle's Tower. This is the one I alluded to at the start of the video. You know, one of my favorite 2D Zelda dungeons of all time. I'd love to have some dramatic things to say, but to be honest, there's nothing that deep about this dungeon. I just think the design is some of the best in the series. First, I'll explain how this dungeon works. The short version is that you need to knock down 4 pillars with a shot put ball, so maneuvering the ball to all 4 of the pillars is the main challenge. The long version, however, is the way you see how goated this dungeon really is. Because as I said, the main challenge here is figuring out how to get the shot put ball where it needs to be. The way this dungeon is so intricately designed with that one goal in mind makes it so every moment is a puzzle. This is one of those dungeons where navigation is the hardest part, but not in a where am I way, more so in a I know what I need to do but I don't know how to do it kind of way. Switches are used for that purpose masterfully here. Half of the ground floor is covered in switch blocks, so whether it's landing on top of them or finding a switch to go a certain way, you always have to keep these in mind when it comes to your decision making. I mentioned it just now, but there's a big emphasis on going between floors here that quite literally adds a new dimension to how you approach things. Can't go back after flipping that switch? Fall down and then come back up. Don't have a way to get the shot put? Fall down and use a different staircase to get up. I haven't even mentioned the mirror shield yet. That's mainly because it's irrelevant to the dungeon though. It's more of a utility tool. And to be fair, being able to block magic projectiles is useful, but it doesn't play a part in this dungeon's progression very much. That's okay though, because the layout itself is so in-depth and puzzling that something like that doesn't really matter. I didn't even mention that Kirby is in this dungeon. For any other, that would likely be one of the first things I'd bring up, but here it's more of a side note than anything else. I wish I could go more in depth, but honestly, I've already said all I can. The dungeon is the puzzle here, so any individual thing doesn't hold as much weight as the experience in full. Make no mistake though, this is one of the most mind-bending and rewarding dungeons in the series. I don't want to overhype or glaze it too much, but I really think this is the best dungeon in Link's Awakening. Overall, Link's Awakening is one of the very best 2D Zeldas, and I think its turtle, rock-solid dungeon lineup plays a big part in that. At first I didn't quite get this game. I wouldn't say that I disliked it, but I wasn't as high on it as many others seem to be. Now though, I think it's finally clicked with me. It's hard to find much of anything wrong with this game, and it's only grown on me over time. That said, if you enjoyed the video, I'd greatly appreciate a like or subscribe. I just recently hit 500 subs, so I have a long ranking video planned to celebrate. I don't know exactly when it'll be ready, but expect it to be around 2 hours long. For now though, thanks for watching. See ya if I see ya.